The Louisiana heat in the summer of 1843 had a quality that felt almost punitive, pressing down on New Orleans like a hand over a mouth, thick with the smell of the river and rotting sugarcane, and the particular sweetness of money being made in ways that decent men preferred not to examine too closely. It was in this heat, in a waterfront warehouse scheduled for demolition, that Jeremiah Aldrich committed the act that would define the remaining 11 years of his life and the precise nature of his death. He had arrived early, as men who plan murders always do. He arranged 3 glasses on the planning table with a care that bordered on tenderness, poured good whiskey into each one, and sat down to wait for the 2 men he intended to kill before midnight. The pistol in his coat pocket was loaded. The skinning knife in his boot had been sharpened that morning. The false witnesses had been paid and rehearsed. Everything was prepared with the methodical efficiency of a man who had spent weeks thinking about this moment and had found, in the thinking, a pleasure he was careful not to name even to himself. Marcus Devo arrived first, nervous and sweating, convinced the meeting was about escape routes and asset transfers. Samuel Rochelle came minutes later, moving with the rolling gait of a man who had spent his best years on ships and never quite lost the ocean's rhythm in his legs. They settled into their chairs, accepted the whiskey, and began talking about survival. They did not know they were already dead. Aldrich shot Devo through the chest before the younger man finished his second sentence. The sound in that enclosed space was enormous and final. Rochelle, 53 years old, and built like the ships he had captained, overturned the table and came across it with a broken whiskey bottle, opening a gash in Aldrich's left cheek that would scar him for life. What followed was not the clean, efficient killing Aldrich had planned, but something uglier and longer. 10 minutes of desperate struggle through scattered ledgers and overturned furniture, 2 men leaving blood on every surface, while one of them slowly ran out of the strength that fury had temporarily provided. When it was finally over, and Rochelle lay dying on the warehouse floor with a blade buried beneath his ribs, the old sailor used the last air in his collapsing lungs to deliver the only weapon he had left. "My son knows everything," he gasped. "When he is old enough and ready, he will come for you. And he will not be alone." Aldrich dismissed this as the delusion of a dying man. He spent the next 4 hours arranging the scene with painstaking care, positioning bodies, manufacturing evidence of a dispute between the 2 victims, inflicting wounds on his own hands and arms, and rehearsing the story he would tell investigators. By morning, the warehouse had been transformed into a narrative that protected him completely. The witnesses performed as paid. The police, overwhelmed and incurious, accepted his account with minimal resistance. Within a week, the building was demolished, destroying the last physical evidence of what had happened inside it, and Jeremiah Aldrich walked out of the worst night of his life into 11 years of unearned prosperity. He should have listened more carefully to a dying man's last words. Philippe Deveau was 22 when his brother's body was returned to the family. He was quiet at the funeral, which those who knew him well recognized as a more serious sign than weeping. The Deveau men had always expressed their grief loudly and dissipated it quickly. Philippe's silence meant the grief had gone somewhere else entirely, somewhere internal and cold and structural, the way a river goes underground and travels for miles before surfacing again with all its original force. He had been his brother's unofficial business manager, meticulous where Marcus was impulsive, patient where Marcus was eager. He had maintained coded records of every Delta Trading Company transaction, not out of any plan for the future, but because he was the kind of man who documented things instinctively, who understood that information kept in careful order was a form of power that required no immediate deployment to be valuable. He knew immediately that the official story was false. Marcus would never have confronted Rochelle with violence over money. Rochelle would never have brought a knife to a financial dispute. Most damningly, Aldrich's account referenced specific accounts and cash reserves that Philippe knew had already been moved to different locations days before the meeting. The lies were not quite careful enough for a man who had memorized the actual truth. Henry Rochelle arrived at his own conclusions through different channels. At 24, Samuel's son had his father's maritime connections married to a formal education in banking and law, a combination that gave him access to financial records that told their own story with cold precision. He traced every transaction Aldrich had made in the weeks following the murders. He documented the systematic looting of his murdered father's accounts, the forged transfer documents, the property acquisitions that could only have been funded by stolen wealth. By the time he and Philippe met for the first time in a quiet French Quarter restaurant in the fall of 1844, Henry had calculated that Aldrich had stolen more than $60,000 from their families. He had also calculated exactly how to get it back, along with considerably more than money. Their complementary skills fit together with the clean precision of something designed rather than discovered. Philippe had the evidence of crimes. Henry had the financial architecture to execute a decade-long dismantling of the man who had committed them. What neither of them had yet, but what both of them understood they would need, was someone inside Willowbrook Plantation itself. Someone who moved through Aldrich's daily life invisibly, as all enslaved people were trained to do, accumulating the intimate knowledge of a man's habits and vulnerabilities that no outside investigation could ever produce. They found her without looking for her, which is how the most important things usually arrive. Celeste had been purchased by Aldrich in 1847 from a failing Mississippi plantation, not because he needed a cook in any urgent sense, but because she was skilled and cheap, and he was the kind of man who acquired things reflexively when they were offered at good prices. He had not purchased her husband. He had not purchased her 3 children. When she had wept and begged him to at least take her youngest daughter, a 10-year-old girl whose name she repeated to him 3 times, as though the repetition might make it matter, he had told her he was running a cotton operation and not a charity for colored families, and he had walked away from her grief the way a man walks away from weather, briefly inconvenienced and immediately forgotten. She had been cooking his meals for 7 years when Philippe and Henry made contact through a free black merchant who visited rural plantations on legitimate business. 7 years of watching a man eat food she had prepared with hands that remembered holding children she would never hold again. 7 years of moving through his house like furniture, cleaning the rooms where he entertained guests who laughed at his stories, pressing his shirts, pouring his coffee, existing in the margins of his life while accumulating every detail of it with the patience of someone who has decided that patience is itself a form of power. She already knew about the financial troubles before they told her. She had been oversalting his food for 2 years, a small invisible cruelty calibrated to aggravate the stomach condition she had noticed him treating with increasing desperation. She had been breaking his personal items with strategic carelessness. She had been spreading quiet anxiety among the other enslaved workers about potential sales to cover his debts. Nothing that could be proven, everything that could be felt. She had been conducting her own campaign of slow destruction long before anyone offered to help her finish it. When Philippe finally revealed who he was and what he intended, Celeste listened without expression until he finished. Then she said that Marcus Devo had been her cousin and Samuel Rochelle her uncle by marriage, and that she had known who Jeremiah Aldrich was and what he had done since the first week she arrived at Willowbrook Plantation. She had been waiting, she said simply, for the right assistance. Her only condition was freedom and safe passage north afterward. She wanted to find her children. She had never stopped wanting to find her children. The plan they constructed together over the following months was a masterpiece of patience and precision. Henry systematically acquired Aldrich's debts through a network of financial intermediaries, purchasing mortgage, calling in favors from banking contacts, and ensuring that every loan renewal came with slightly elevated interest rates and payment structures designed to maximize cash flow problems during critical seasons. Philippe cultivated a casual social acquaintance with Aldrich himself, positioning himself as a harmless peripheral figure in the plantation owner's shrinking social circle, while monitoring the progression of his financial deterioration with careful satisfaction. The gambling was the mechanism they used to accelerate the collapse. Aldrich had developed his addiction organically, which made it more reliable than anything they could have manufactured. They simply ensured that the games he was invited to were controlled environments where the other players were coordinated, where his occasional wins were engineered to keep him at the table, and where the final losses were timed to coincide precisely with the moment his other financial defenses had been reduced to nothing. By February of 1854 he was hollowed out. The cotton operation that had once represented his successful reinvention was mortgaged beyond recovery. His personal accounts were empty. His social reputation, always more fragile than he understood, had been quietly undermined through years of carefully placed whispers about his financial instability and erratic behavior. When Philippe and Henry finally confronted him in the fog-shrouded waterfront warehouse where his crimes had originated 11 years earlier, he arrived already defeated, carrying $8,000 in a leather satchel that represented the last of everything he had stolen from the men whose sons now waited for him in the shadows. The card game stripped him of the money in 3 hours. When the last hand was lost, and the other players had disappeared into the fog like figures in a fever dream, Philippe stepped out of the darkness and let the gaslight find his face. Aldrich made a sound that was not quite a word. The resemblance to his murdered brother was precise and deliberate. Philippe had cultivated it over years, allowing the bone structure they shared to become its own accusation. Henry spread the documents across the empty poker table with the calm efficiency of a man presenting evidence he has organized 100 times in his mind. Everything was there. Every stolen transaction, every forged transfer, every bribed official, every crime laid out in chronological order with the kind of documentation that left no interpretive room whatsoever. Aldrich looked at the papers the way a man looks at the ground rushing up toward him after a fall, with the blank recognition of someone who has already understood that understanding changes nothing. The marriage proposition was delivered without drama, which made it worse. They were not angry. They were not theatrical. They presented the destruction of his social identity as a business arrangement, explaining the terms with the same measured tone they might have used to discuss a cotton contract. He would marry Celeste in a legal ceremony, publicly and permanently, presenting it to his neighbors as a voluntary act of Christian benevolence. He would live with her as husband and wife. He would provide for her welfare as he would any spouse. In exchange, his creditors would refrain from immediate collection, and he would be permitted to continue breathing. The alternative was left largely unspecified, which was far more frightening than any explicit threat. Men who have spent 11 years planning something are not men who run out of ideas. Aldrich signed the contract with hands that shook so badly the signature was barely legible. He told himself that he would find a way out once he had bought time through compliance. He had survived worse situations than this through patience and careful calculation. He would comply until an escape presented itself. He did not understand that the escape had already been removed years ago by people who had anticipated every door he might try and quietly locked each one from the outside. The ceremony took place at Willowbrook Plantation on a gray March evening before an audience of bewildered neighbors who had been told they were witnessing a demonstration of Christian charity. Celeste appeared in a simple white gown, moving through the assembled crowd with a composure that several guests would later describe as remarkable, a word they used because they lacked the more accurate one, which was triumphant. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Aldrich leaned forward for the obligatory kiss, Celeste steadied him with one hand, and the gentleness of the gesture was the most terrifying thing anyone present had ever seen. The first month of marriage was an education in sophisticated cruelty. Celeste managed the household with impeccable efficiency, played the devoted wife for every visitor, and administered the poison in doses so carefully calibrated that his decline appeared to any outside observer as the natural deterioration of a man whose mind and body had been broken by financial stress and social humiliation. The arsenic went into his coffee, his evening wine, the particular dishes she knew he favored. His symptoms, the stomach cramping, the dizziness, the progressive weakness, were indistinguishable from what grief and shame do to a man who has lost everything. When his physician identified signs of chronic poisoning and Aldrich attempted to explain what was happening to him, the explanation was dismissed as paranoid delusion. No one could believe that a recently enslaved woman possessed either the resources or the sophistication to conduct such a precise medical murder. His accusations seemed only to confirm what people had already decided, that Jeremiah Aldrich had lost his mind along with his money and his dignity, and that the strange woman he had inexplicably married was bearing the burden of his deterioration with admirable patience. He began preparing his own food in secret. He locked his study and ate crackers he purchased himself from a merchant in town. He stopped drinking anything Celeste had touched. His symptoms briefly improved, which both confirmed his suspicions and deepened his isolation, because a man who refuses to eat his wife's cooking at his own dinner table in front of guests is a man that polite society has already decided to stop taking seriously. Celeste adjusted without changing her expression. She waited. The anniversary dinner in June was the final act, performed for an audience of neighbors who came expecting an evening of uncomfortable social theater and received instead a front-row seat to the conclusion of an 11-year story whose beginning none of them knew. The wine was opened ceremonially before everyone present. No tampering was possible. Aldrich, surrounded by witnesses, trapped inside the performance of a functioning marriage that he could not publicly contradict, raised the glass to his lips and drank, because refusing would have required an explanation that would have sounded to every person in that room like the final confirmation of his madness. As he felt the first cramping begin, sharp and immediate and unmistakably different from the slow accumulation of previous months, he looked across the table at his wife. She held his gaze with the stillness of someone who has arrived at a destination after a very long journey and is taking a moment simply to acknowledge that she is there. He collapsed before the main course was served. In the chaos that followed, Celeste moved to his side with the desperate urgency of a devoted wife, holding his head, weeping with convincing anguish, making it impossible for the doctor to reach him effectively, while simultaneously making it impossible for anyone present to suspect that her grief was anything other than genuine. She leaned close to his ear in what the surrounding guests took for a final whispered endearment. She told him who she was. She told him about Marcus and Samuel and her children and the 7 years of coffee and oversalted meals and quiet, deliberate patience. She told him that justice had found him the way water finds its level, slowly and inevitably, and through every crack in the foundation of a life built on other people's suffering. Jeremiah Aldrich died at 9:47 in the evening, surrounded by neighbors who mourned him as a troubled man brought low by bad luck and mental fragility. The official cause of death was listed as nervous exhaustion, a diagnosis that satisfied everyone except the 3 people who understood what had actually occurred and had no interest in correcting the record. Celeste was gone within the month. The plantation transferred to Henry and Philippe in settlement of outstanding debts. Her freedom secured through documents that had been prepared years in advance by people who planned for their conclusions the way architects plan for load-bearing walls, understanding that the ending has to be built into the beginning or the whole structure falls. Willowbrook Plantation became a station on the Underground Railroad within the year. The house where Aldrich had entertained Louisiana's elite opened its doors to people fleeing the institution that had made him wealthy, its cellars hiding the living where his stolen money had once been counted.